I'm not entirely sure. I'll have to do some research on that.
Well, that's a bit late now, considering we're recording the episode right now, George.
Hello and welcome to our podcast Pager. I'm George Milner.
And I'm Stan Dale.
Tune in to hear us talk with some amazing people about the subjects changing medicine today.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Pager Podcast Valentine special, where we'll be answering your questions about love, the podcast, and the podcast.
Over the last few weeks, our eager listeners sent in some questions for us to answer, and answer them we will.
So, George, I was wondering this year, I've had a lot of free time on my hands, and I've been wondering, sort of what is the origin of Valentine's Day? How did this day come about?
Well, firstly, as a disclaimer, I'm a medical student, not a historian, but I did do a bit of research into this.
That's never stopped you talking about anything you didn't understand before, George. I don't understand why you're bringing it up now.
Absolutely not. So, it was actually named after St. Valentine, who was a 3rd century priest in Rome. So, at the time, rumour has it, Roman soldiers weren't allowed to marry because Emperor Claudius at the time thought it would interfere with their work and cause all sorts of problems within the empire, so they weren't allowed to marry. But sneaky St. Valentine started to marry them in secret behind the emperor's back. And rumour has it that's where the idea of Valentine's Day came about.
So why is Valentine's Day on the 14th of February?
Well, that's a very good question. And in fact, in AD 270, he was actually executed, rumour has it, on Valentine's Day by Emperor Claudius II for his part in these shenanigans.
The things people do for love.
There's also a more sneaky suggestion that the Catholic Church did actually put the date in mid-February to make the pagan celebration of Lupercalia, the fertility festival around the Roman god of agriculture, more Christian. So they were trying to, on one hand, fight off the pagans and try to reclaim that part of the month of Christianity. But there's also perhaps a slightly more romantic or less romantic, depending on your view, suggestion that it was the day that St. Valentine was executed by Emperor Claudius, incidentally after falling in love with the jailer's daughter, to whom he apparently wrote a message signed off "From your Valentine," which is where the phrase that's now coined on many a card around this time of year comes from.
What are you talking about? I've never received a card which said that.
I know, neither have I, but I've seen it in popular culture before.
That doesn't actually surprise me about Lupercalia, because it was a completely bizarre and wild pagan festival. So, George, why is it that the heart has historically been associated with love? Why not any other organ? I mean, you think the brain, which is where our thoughts occur, would be a more suitable candidate. So why is it that the heart is associated with love?
Well, that's a very good question, in fact, Stan. Very good question, or whoever sent it in. And I think I'll start off by saying that the association between the heart and love isn't a very new one. So there's been evidence that the ancient Greeks and the Egyptians used the heart as a symbol of love as well. And in kind of more general terms, Greek philosophers like Plato argued that the heart was actually kind of associated with all kind of strong emotions, including love. They thought it was where your soul was located. And I guess that's kind of where the idea of from the heart comes from in the end. And it kind of makes sense because one thing about your brain is it doesn't have any nerve endings in it. You don't really notice it until something kind of goes wrong with it. Whereas you notice your heart racing when you're scared, for example, or even, for example, with sexual attraction. So it kind of makes sense that you'd think that your heart could be doing something relating to that, especially if you don't understand really the machinery that's up in your brain, which is actually behind love.
Oh, I see what you mean. It's very interesting.
Yeah, and this all got kind of carried through. So I think the heart was associated with a lot of things, seen as the centre of the body as well. Interestingly enough, the reason that you have your wedding ring on the 4th finger of your left hand is that it was thought that there was a vein called the vena amoris heading from your 4th finger all the way to your heart. I can't remember my first year anatomy very well, so I can't comment on whether this is true or not.
That's fascinating. So I suppose it does make sense that you would think that, that thing in your chest, which is beating really, thumping away when you're having a strong attraction towards somebody, you notice somebody who strikes you, might be the cause of that.
I can see your heart thumping right now, Stan. Yeah, and I guess this leads on quite nicely to talking about why we associate the traditional heart symbol with the heart and love. And this is quite a kind of an interesting question for a number of reasons, and I don't really have a kind of a clear answer to it. But I'll start off with how the symbol of the heart actually came about, which was another question on our list. And it was thought there were quite a few different suggestions for why it could have come about. One of them was that it came from leaves. One of them was that it came from the silphium plant, which is a type of fennel. Don't go try and find it because it's extinct now. But in the 7th century BC, in what is now modern-day Libya, it was quite valuable and it was used as a form of birth control. So the seeds of this plant, incidentally, were shaped as a heart, as you might expect from where the story is going. And in fact, the Libyans at the time put it on their currency and thought of it as quite valuable. So that's probably one of the kind of first clear examples of hearts actually being used as a symbol. But they were only really associated with love when it came into kind of medieval times. And interestingly enough, around then they were actually shown upside down, but then they got flipped up to the normal form that we see them now. Now, quite how they were actually associated with love, I'm not too sure, but I mean, it could be they do bear some resemblance to an actual heart with the two sets of chambers on either side. So that could have been how it came about. But with all these symbols, they kind of morphed into something else. There are other suggestions that actually this heart more strongly resembles the hearts, or the symbol of a heart more strongly resembles the heart of reptiles and birds, which kind of makes sense if you're gaining all of your anatomy from cutting up
dissecting
reptiles
those
and birds
animals.
at the time. Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. So that's perhaps why it could have come about, but the link to love is a little bit tenuous, I think.
I see. Okay. And there's no sort of more modern 19th century. I could imagine some sort of Victorian association which arose. Seems like a lot of culture.
Yeah, well, I think it's in the kind of 1700s, around then was when Valentine's Day got popular. And I think it just grew in prominence, all the way from the Middle Ages up to now. And there's some quite interesting manuscripts from France, initially the first ones, of people actually presenting human hearts to their lovers, which we might see as a bit strange now.
Works in mysterious ways.
Love works in mysterious ways indeed. And with that, I think I'm going to ask another question to you, Stan, which was sent in by one of our listeners, which is, what is the science behind a crush? And the second part, how can you scientifically trick someone into falling in love with you?
Oh, it's a really good question, and it's one I actually struggle to make much headway with, because the neurobiology behind why we feel feelings of attraction, crushes, or even love is quite complicated and not particularly well understood. But there are a few things we can pick out. First of all, I think it's important to note that what we mean by a crush is quite different to love, I think. Crush being sort of very intense feelings, which arise and then perhaps pass without necessarily getting to know somebody particularly well.
Actually, that's interesting, because I know there's been research that says that you can rate people as more attractive when you see just a fleeting glance of them, which I guess fits in with the kind of, in an evolutionary sense, that you want to have a second take. If you see somebody who could be potentially an attractive mate, there's a far higher risk from walking away than for taking another look and then deciding, actually, you're not so interested.
Yeah, exactly. There hasn't been a lot of research looking at crushes specifically, but what we can do is look at some of the chemicals which are involved in perhaps more prolonged feelings of love and social connection versus the things which are associated with those immediate sort of more strong feelings we experience. And the key transmitters which have been identified for those more transient feelings have been dopamine, adrenaline, and serotonin. And I think adrenaline is one we can all sort of recognize, because we know what it's like to experience having your heart raised, sweaty palms, and even dilated pupils, all of which are the effects of the release of the hormone adrenaline from the adrenal glands. Incidentally, one of the most well-characterized attributes which people find attractive is dilated pupils. That is thought to be because dilated pupils indicate that somebody is also attracted in you, which is quite helpful.
I'm short-sighted, as I used to, so we can't necessarily pick up on these cues, but we're sure they're there.
I don't even know what to say to that. So that's a bit of science behind the key molecules involved in transient attraction to people. The other molecules, which I think we'll talk about later in a bit more depth, are oxytocin and vasopressin. And these are both hormones released from the posterior pituitary gland, which is a gland within your brain. They seem to be a lot more associated with these sort of prolonged social bonds, which are important for feelings of actual love, whatever we mean by love. Moving on to the second part of that question. How can you scientifically trick someone into falling in love with you? I'm not sure I'm able to explain exactly how you can trick someone into falling in love with you. But studies have been done looking at sort of the behaviors which tend to help people do better in interpersonal relationships. And I suppose it depends on where this listener's finding trouble. Is it in attracting people in the first place? Or have they met someone? A meta-analysis of sort of 54 papers looking at behaviors and their effects on interpersonal relationships found that, so a study looked at the importance of body language in speed dating, right? And they found the most important thing was expansive body language, which quite literally just meant expanding to fill the space of the seat you were in, and having sort of a relaxed and full-out posture instead of...
But I assume expansive within limits.
Yes, like all of these things that we'll be talking about, actually, it's really easy to think about a situation where you take any of these tips too far and it suddenly becomes very creepy. So eye contact or some laughter or any of these things. But they found that sort of within what they defined as expansive body language, this led to a 76% increase in the success rate.
And what about hosting a medical podcast?
It was associated with 100% decrease in the success rate.
Oh, that's strange. Hopefully not a significant difference.
I don't think there's any really robust data that's come out about how you can help somebody to develop more prolonged feelings for you, except for interacting in more than one setting, essentially. So you develop trust in more than one sort of environment. So say you worked with somebody, interacting with them outside of work in other sort of situations, that seems to develop more meaningful relationships. So George, we've spoken a bit about this molecule, oxytocin, and we've said that it's very important in these social bonds. It's released during childbirth, and it's also released during other sort of social interactions where there's touch. And that includes sex, just touching somebody's skin. All of this leads to the release of oxytocin. It's very important in the maternal-offspring relationship for developing bonds between those two. It's also actually involved in sort of milk production, so this hormone has a lot of other effects in the body. And interesting studies in humans have actually shown that if you deliver some oxytocin intranasally, it changes the way that people behave. So people start to make more eye contact with the people they're around, and they also show more social cognition, whatever that means.
And they show more trust as well. So they put individuals in kind of game-like scenarios where they kind of won or lost money, and they showed that actually people were more trusting of strangers and people they didn't know when they'd had this intranasal oxytocin, interestingly enough. Yeah. And indeed, if you give antagonists for oxytocin to kind of sheep and rats just after they've given birth, they don't actually exhibit kind of normal maternal behaviour towards their offspring. On the other hand, if you infuse oxytocin into the cerebrospinal fluid that kind of bathes your brain and your spinal cord, this can also lead to sheep basically adopting foreign lambs that aren't in fact their own. So these hormones are obviously playing quite kind of powerful roles.
Clearly they're playing very really powerful roles in
caregiving.
Yeah, in caregiving. And I wonder how much can be said about the role they play in sort of more romantic love.
Romantic love, well, that's an interesting question as well, which I had a bit of a look at. So there's some quite strong evidence that actually oxytocin is higher in new lovers than in single people. And that actually these levels can roughly predict whether people are going to stay together. Obviously not perfectly, but predict maybe after 6 months whether these partners are going to stay together.
I wonder if there's any if there are any companies offering testing of these levels. I wonder if you've started a relationship, you can go somewhere and get your oxytocin levels tested if you're saying it's an important correlate for the success of relationships.
Yeah, I imagine where there's a will, there's a way. There are probably lots of companies thinking of doing something like that. I know there are companies that are thinking of introducing oxytocin supplementation and stuff like that. We were talking about its kind of role in social function. There's an idea that perhaps it could be used to make people more comfortable and reduce social anxiety and phobias and things. So that's one area that it could possibly be used in, but perhaps it could also be used in people who are a bit sceptical of whether their partner is kind of truly in love with them or not. But I'm not sure exactly how predictive it is.
And I suppose the flip side of that is that too much oxytocin could make somebody too trusting and therefore open to being taken advantage of in sort of other situations, perhaps. So perhaps there's an equilibrium, there's a bit of a balance to be struck. I'm not really sure.
Oxytocin has its darker sides as well. I don't know if you've looked at these.
George, we get it. You've done more research than I have. Just tell us about it.
Well, so there's, I guess the theme going throughout this is that oxytocin is basically promotes the social bonds and these bonds between partners as well. But in a study done by Dutch researchers, they found out that actually a little snort of oxytocin made people more positive about fictional Dutch characters, but more negative about characters with Arab or German sounding names. So there's the suggestion that actually oxytocin could be perhaps disadvantageous when it moves people's biases towards people from their own social group anyway. And this kind of makes sense. Oxytocin might simply kind of exaggerate feelings that are already there and actually could lead to this kind of us and them scenario and a few more social divisions and things like that. So actually it might not necessarily be entirely positive.
Yeah, clearly these are very complicated things to really try and grapple with. A study I read which I thought was quite interesting was I can't remember which animals it was in, but they did animal experiments where the animals had the vasopressin receptors in their brains knocked out, and their ability to form like romantic relationships with, sorry, not really romantic, sort of partner relationships for rearing young, completely collapsed, which suggested, at least in that species, that maybe vasopressin was, I don't want to say more important than oxytocin, but certainly not something to be overlooked.
Yeah, so oxytocin probably isn't the only factor at play here. Although it's interesting actually that there have been kind of studies into animal models and also human models of this, but only, I think, less than 5% of mammalian species actually form these kind of long-term pair bonds that we're talking about over multiple years, where actually they kind of mate with somebody for life. We always think of kind of humans doing that, and we hear these kind of lovely stories of albatrosses doing that too. But actually most mammals don't engage in such activity.
And this leads us really nicely onto the question of like whether animals can experience love.
Well, I know you had a look at this, didn't you?
Sort of very briefly, but it's actually a very difficult thing to find any evidence or data for. So really, this is just, I suppose, my opinion. It's sort of a tricky question, George. I mean, even knowing whether other human beings experience love in the same way that any of us do is hard enough. My intuition is that mammals, because they have the same limbic structures that we do, probably can experience at least some of the aspects of what we would associate with love. Whether that's romantic love or not is sort of really difficult to say. I think when you're thinking about creatures like fish and reptiles, whose brains are structured very differently, and they don't have these structures which have a lot of the glands they don't have a lot of the brain structures which are involved in the signaling pathways we've been talking about. I suspect they don't experience anything similar to what we would consider love. But the interesting question is this. We obviously have, a lot of our brains are quite similar to other mammals, except for our cortexes. Now, is there something important between the interaction between the limbic system and the cortex, which produces love in humans? What do you think, man? You tell me.
Yeah, I guess there are two different parts to it. Whether animals actually feel love in the same way that we do, or whether they feel love. So I think just because it's perhaps a different sort of relationship and different sort of attraction doesn't necessarily mean that it has less merit. And I'd perhaps make the distinction between the short-term and long-term love as well. We talked about kind of pair bonds earlier on in this episode, and I'd say that's perhaps more indicative of love as we kind of see it. So perhaps, more differences can be seen with animals that don't form these kind of long-term pair bonds.
What do you think about dogs? Because we don't pair bond with dogs, but if you spend a lot of time with dogs, you can see why people think that dogs can experience sort of love for human beings, right?
And interestingly, studies have shown that playing with your dog can release oxytocin in your brain too.
Yeah, so I suppose the relationship goes both ways.
Yeah. Although I think one thing I know about my dog is my dog will love anybody. So she'll come back and she'll love everybody when
That's a good point. So
when they come home. So maybe it's not necessarily intrinsic to the fact that it's me, but it's the fact that my dog could quite happily fall in love with somebody else.
So
what you're sad thought.
What you're saying is that perhaps, maybe this isn't quite what you're saying, but perhaps dogs they mimic behaviours which we associate with love without having almost the exclusivity that we would consider a prerequisite for love.
And I guess we're talking about romantic love in this sense, but love doesn't necessarily have to be kind of exclusive if you think of kind of more broad definitions of kind of loving family members as well.
Okay, George, we've got another question from a listener. Is there a spike in births 9 months after Valentine's Day? What do you think?
Well, a bit of digging actually came up with quite a lot. So I think we should start at the beginning with this. So the 14th of February, Valentine's Day, to the 14th of November, 9 months later, it's 274 days. So that's about 39 weeks and 1 day. And the average gestation is about 40 weeks or 280 days. So we're pretty much kind of around that. But what I should add is that the human gestational period isn't necessarily constant amongst all individuals. There's a big kind of distribution of it. So I think 15% in 2018 of babies in England and Wales were born at 38 weeks, 26% at 39 weeks. So we see this kind of spread. So we're unlikely to see a massive peak exactly
9 months to the day.
9 months after it, because actually a relatively small proportion of babies conceived on Valentine's Day will actually be born
on sort of the expected due date.
Yeah, on exactly 9 months after it, so 39 weeks and 1 day. And this leads us on nicely to data that came up from NHS England that estimated that, in fact, conceptions in the week of Valentine's Day and in the week following it were higher than average. So I think in 2015 it was 16,263 in the week just after Valentine's Day, and in the 16,000s as well in the week after that. So that's higher than the kind of early 15,000s that we saw for the average of the year, and second only to kind of around the Christmas period. So from that evidence, it does seem like actually there is an increase in conceptions around Valentine's Day and in the kind of the week afterwards. Now, this doesn't necessarily relate exactly to the question that we were asked, which is there a spike in births 9 months after Valentine's Day?
I didn't know chocolate could get you pregnant.
I'll tell you when you're older. Is there a spike in births? And there's a nice little tool online from the Office of National Statistics, which looks up how popular is your birthday. And from 1995 to 2014, it doesn't actually seem like November was that popular time to be born. So the most popular time in November was the 12th of November, with an average of 1,854 births per day. But this was only the 81st most popular day of the year, so quite a few before that. Meanwhile, we see September the 26th as being the most popular.
Which is 9 months after Christmas.
Which is 9 months after Christmas. But what's really interesting again is that we see a spike in a far kind of greater period around then. So we see a spike all the way from September the 17th to October the 4th, where all of these days enter the top 20 for most births in the year. And yeah, there are a few kind of explanations potentially for this.
Do you think people are having just more sex in winter?
Well, it could be that. Or it could actually be that now as people have become much more in tune with kind of planning pregnancy, that people want their kids to be born at particular times.
Oh, the beginning of the school year.
Beginning of the school year, indeed.
Crafty
people, yeah. And there's been quite a lot of research that suggests that if you are born at the beginning of the school year, you do better academically, you're more likely to enter professional sport and things like that. So perhaps it's that lots of people are deciding that they want to have kids at that period so they can give them the best kind of start in life overall. And interestingly, it's seen in different countries as well. It's seen in Australia and America. There are some days in the year that actually are it's far less likely for people to give birth on them. Christmas Day, Boxing Day, they rank last. This is related to, I think, the idea now that I think over 30% of births are actually induced for whatever reason. Maybe it's a caesarean section, maybe it's via drugs, for a number of different reasons. And you don't induce birth typically on bank holidays around then when hospitals aren't fully functioning. So another rather to the point question that was sent in by one of our listeners was simply, will I ever find love? Stan, could you answer this one for me?
I'll give it a shot, George. Okay, listener. Will you ever find love? If you're in sort of the typical demographic for our listeners, you're probably pretty young. And I suppose I'll start this answer by saying it depends on what you mean by love. What really is love. And it's something that people have thought about for thousands of years. And I don't think everyone can really agree on a definition. It's sort of interesting to note that like the Greeks had 6 different words for different kinds of love. Love for everyone, love for sort of humanity, love for one person over a prolonged period of time, kind of more sexual love. So yeah, that's sort of the disclaimer we'll start with.
Although I guess most people would say that by that broad definition, they've probably found love already. People have family members and friends who they might say they love. I imagine this question is more targeted towards the romantic side.
Love. Yeah, you are right. Okay. The good news is most people do seem to find partners. So the data shows that 51% of the adult population in the UK are married. Not that obviously being married is the only way of finding love, or that all people who are married are in love. But as a proxy, it's sort of one of the most easily traced statistics. So we'll kind of roll with it. And another 0.2% of people are in civil partnerships. And a lot of people live together without being married. So in total, 61% of adults in the UK are living with a partner. So there is hope out there. The bad news is that the trend is slightly reversing amongst younger people. So younger people are less likely to have found partners by a given age, long-term partners, than their parents were.
But is this relating to love? Could it be relating to perhaps more freedom and less pressure to move in with somebody who you're not necessarily in love with?
Yeah, it's a fair point.
I think many people, perhaps a few generations ago, might have felt pressured to get married at a young age, and I guess statistically, you might say, using this proxy, that they are in love and they are with a partner, but they might not necessarily be that happy in that situation. Whereas I guess modern society now is, I think, more accepting of people being single, and actually people moving out of relationships that are maybe abusive or they're uncomfortable in, or actually when they just don't love their partner, it's easier to get divorced than ever before. Could it be that actually love rates have stayed the same, but this kind of non-consensual or forced partnering up has reduced.
Has reduced. Yeah, it's a very good point. I guess you just sort of work with the statistics that we have available, because it's hard to track it any better than that, I suppose.
That's a cop out.
Well, you tell me. Yeah, the other piece of advice I would have, listener, is it depends on how long you live. So if you can avoid dying in the near future, you are more likely to find love. And that seems to be the biggest determinant of finding love in your lifetime. A second piece of advice would be an entirely different question, is like whether you'll be able to keep the love you find. I'm interested, George. What do you think about this idea that people, this happily ever after idea? Is that sort of what we really see in terms of population statistics for marriage, or
yeah?
Do most people who fall in love stay in love with someone?
Yeah, it's hard to tell, because I guess people often talk about love having, or relationships having, multiple different phases, having that kind of early phase where you're kind of super attracted to somebody and you want to spend every moment with them, and then kind of that slightly wearing off and you kind of settling into a kind of more normal phase. I'm not sure what if rates of divorce and things like that kind of point us in the direction of the fact that actually people can kind of fall out of love quite easily. There's certainly a lot of evidence out there that actually love can last an entire lifetime for quite a number of people. Just how many people is, I think, up for
hard
debate.
to tell. Yeah. My advice to this listener, having basically copped out of answering the question, as George has said, is to remain optimistic, and I would focus in the meantime on other forms of love, like loving yourself.